The bullies pulled her hoodie to humiliate. She flipped them both instantly. The early morning mist clung to the windows of Roosevelt High School like ghostly fingers, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to mirror 17-year-old Kira Westbrook's internal state as she approached the imposing brick building that had become both her daily destination and her personal nightmare. She pulled her oversized grey hoodie tighter around her small 5-foot frame, the soft cotton fabric serving as both physical comfort and psychological armor against the hostile environment that awaited her beyond those heavy glass doors. Her dark chestnut hair fell like a protective curtain across her pale face, partially obscuring the sharp emerald eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of her surroundings, while revealing nothing of the turmoil that churned within her mind. Those eyes, which her grandmother had once described as old soul eyes, held depths of wisdom and pain that seemed far beyond her 17 years. The weight of her experiences had carved subtle lines of premature worry around them, lines that shouldn't have existed on someone so young. At barely 5 feet tall, with a slight, almost fragile-looking build that belied the strength hidden beneath, Kira moved through the crowded corridors of Roosevelt High like a specter haunting familiar halls. She had perfected the art of invisibility over the past 3 months since her family's relocation, keeping close to the walls, avoiding eye contact, and timing her movements to coincide with the natural flow of student traffic. Most of her fellow students didn't even register her presence as they rushed past, engrossed in their own social dramas and academic pressures, which was exactly how she preferred it. Anonymity had become her shield, silence her sword. The transition from her previous life in the quiet suburban enclave of Millbrook to this sprawling urban educational institution had been jarring enough without the additional complications that had emerged. Her old school, Millbrook Academy, had been smaller and more intimate, with only 300 students spread across 4 grades. There, being the quiet, introspective kid was just another personality trait in a diverse tapestry of adolescent characteristics, rather than a target painted in bright red across her back for predators to spot from a distance. The move itself had been necessitated by her father's job transfer to the regional headquarters of his engineering firm, a promotion that came with significantly better pay but required uprooting their family from the only home Kira had ever known. Her parents, David and Sarah Westbrook, had tried to frame it as an adventure, an opportunity for new experiences and personal growth. But for Kira, who had always been slow to warm up to new situations and people, it felt more like exile from everything familiar and safe. The morning sun, pale and struggling through the perpetual haze of city smog, streamed through the tall, narrow windows that lined the main hallway of Roosevelt High, casting long shadows across the scuffed linoleum tiles that had seen decades of student footsteps. The building itself was a testament to 1960s institutional architecture, all functional lines and practical surfaces designed more for durability than aesthetics. The walls, painted in what some optimistic administrator had probably once considered a cheerful yellow but had faded over time to a sickly mustard color, were lined with dented metal lockers that bore the accumulated scratches, dents, and graffiti of countless students who had passed through these halls. Kira made her way toward her locker, number 247, located in what she had mentally dubbed no man's land, a section of hallway that seemed to exist in the space between established social territories. Her worn black Converse sneakers, which had been her faithful companions since freshman year and bore the scars of countless miles walked, made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor as she navigated through the familiar choreography of morning chaos. The cacophony of teenage life surrounded her like a living thing, the metallic crash of locker doors slamming shut, the rapid-fire chatter of students catching up on weekend adventures or cramming for first-period tests, the squeak of sneakers against linoleum, The electronic beeps and chimes of smartphones delivering the latest social media updates, and the occasional outburst of laughter or frustrated exclamation. Over the months, Kira had learned to tune out most of this auditory assault, creating a mental bubble of silence that allowed her to function in the overwhelming environment. She kept her head down, focusing intently on the scuffed tiles beneath her feet, as if they held the secrets of the universe. Each tile told a story of the thousands of students who had walked this path before her. There was the one with the permanent black mark from some long-ago art project gone wrong, another with a small crack that had been growing imperceptibly larger each day, and yet another that had been replaced recently and stood out like a dental crown among its weathered neighbors. The familiar weight of her well-worn backpack, loaded with textbooks, and the remnants of dreams she'd carried from her old life pressed against her shoulders as she walked. Inside that bag were not just the tools of her education, her carefully organized binders, color-coded pens, and the latest assignments she'd completed with her characteristic precision, but also the small talismans of her former existence. A photo of her old martial arts dojo, a friendship bracelet from her best friend Elena, who still lived 3 states away, and a small notebook filled with her private thoughts and observations about her new life. Well, well, look who's gracing us with her magnificent presence this fine morning. A voice cut through the ambient noise like a heated knife through butter, each word dripping with the particular brand of adolescent cruelty that had the power to turn a stomach and freeze blood in veins. Kira's stomach plummeted like a stone dropped from a great height, and she felt the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and dread flood her system. She didn't need to look up to identify the speaker. That voice, with its perfectly modulated tone of mock friendliness masking genuine malice, had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past several weeks. Blake Morrison, the self-appointed emperor of Roosevelt High's complex social hierarchy, stood directly in her path like a human roadblock, his imposing figure casting a shadow that seemed to swallow her whole. At well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and muscled frame that came from years of dedicated football training, Blake commanded attention wherever he went, and he knew it. His perfectly styled golden blonde hair caught the morning light streaming through the windows, creating an almost angelic halo effect that was utterly at odds with the decidedly unangelic intentions that lurked behind his ice-blue eyes. Those eyes, which might have been attractive under different circumstances, held a cold calculation that made Kira's skin crawl. His expensive designer clothes, a crisp white button-down shirt that probably cost more than Kira's entire wardrobe, perfectly fitted dark jeans that had never seen a day of actual work, and leather boots that gleamed with the kind of shine that only came from professional care, marked him as someone who had never wanted for anything material in his 18 years of existence. Blake Morrison was the kind of person who had been born on third base and spent his life convinced he'd hit a triple. His father owned the largest car dealership in the city, and his mother sat on the school board, which explained why teachers and administrators always seemed to give him the benefit of the doubt, even when his behavior was clearly problematic. He moved through Roosevelt High like he owned it, because in many ways, he effectively did. Flanking him in perfect formation were his 2 constant companions, forming what Kira had privately dubbed the unholy trinity of Roosevelt High's bullying ecosystem. Tyler Brennan stood to Blake's left, almost as tall as his leader, but with a lankier build that somehow made him seem even more menacing. His dirty blonde hair was styled in what appeared to be a deliberately messy fashion that probably took him an hour to achieve each morning. And his narrow face was dominated by pale blue eyes that seemed to find cruel amusement in others' discomfort. A permanent smirk played across his thin lips as if he was perpetually enjoying some private joke at the expense of everyone around him. Tyler was the son of a prominent local lawyer, and he had inherited both his father's sharp intellect and his complete lack of empathy for those he considered beneath his social station. On Blake's right stood Madison Cross, a girl whose beauty was as undeniable as it was dangerous. Her long, platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves that caught the light and seemed to shimmer with each movement, and her ice-blue eyes were the color of winter sky. Her features were classically beautiful: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and full lips that could shift from innocent smile to cruel sneer in the space of a heartbeat. But there was something predatory in her gaze, a calculating intelligence that she used like a weapon against anyone who crossed her path or simply had the misfortune to catch her attention. Madison's father was a successful plastic surgeon who had moved to the city from Los Angeles, bringing with him Hollywood sensibilities about appearance and status that his daughter had absorbed completely. She dressed like she'd stepped off the pages of a fashion magazine, always perfectly put together in outfits that managed to skirt the edge of the school dress code without quite crossing the line. Her manicured nails, currently painted a deep crimson that reminded Kira uncomfortably of blood, clicked against her latest model smartphone as she prepared to document whatever entertainment Blake had planned for the morning. Together, they formed Roosevelt High's most feared triumvirate, and for reasons that Kira still couldn't fully comprehend, they had decided to make her their primary target for recreational cruelty. Perhaps it was her newness that had attracted their attention, or maybe it was the way she seemed to challenge their dominance simply by refusing to acknowledge it. Whatever the reason, they had been circling her like sharks, scenting blood in the water for weeks now, and each encounter seemed to escalate in intensity and malice. "I'm talking to you, Hoodie girl," Blake continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of mock friendliness that was somehow more threatening than outright hostility. The nickname had stuck despite Kira's efforts to ignore it, becoming her unofficial designation among students who knew of her existence, but not her actual name. "Don't you think it's incredibly rude to ignore someone when they're trying to be nice and sociable? Didn't your parents teach you basic manners?" The question hit closer to home than Blake could have known. Kira's parents had indeed taught her manners, along with respect for others and the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their social status. They had also taught her about the martial arts philosophy of avoiding conflict whenever possible, using violence only as an absolute last resort when all other options had been exhausted. These lessons, which had seemed so clear and straightforward in the safety of her family home, became murky and complicated in the harsh reality of high school social dynamics. Kira finally raised her head, forcing herself to meet Blake's penetrating blue gaze for just a moment before looking away again. The brief eye contact felt like touching a live wire, dangerous and painful. "I'm just trying to get to my locker," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. The words came out more tentatively than she'd intended, and she immediately regretted the weakness they conveyed. Tyler laughed, a harsh, grating sound that seemed designed to attract attention from other students in the hallway. Several heads turned in their direction, sensing the familiar dynamics of a brewing confrontation. "Did you guys hear that?" he announced to his audience with theatrical amazement. She actually spoke. I was honestly starting to think she was mute, or maybe that she only communicated through grunts and hand gestures like some kind of primitive cave person. The comparison stung more than Kira cared to admit. She had always been articulate and well-spoken, earning praise from teachers for her thoughtful contributions to class discussions and her well-crafted essays. But here at Roosevelt High, surrounded by these predators who seemed to feed on others' discomfort, her voice seemed to abandon her when she needed it most. "Maybe she's just embarrassed about her voice," Madison added with false sweetness, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her phone screen as she angled the device to capture the interaction. The sound of the recording starting was barely audible, But Kira caught it and felt her anxiety spike even higher. I mean, if I looked like that and dressed like that, I'd probably never want to talk either. Some people just don't have anything interesting to say. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Madison had an uncanny ability to identify and exploit people's deepest insecurities, and Kira's self-consciousness about her appearance was clearly written across her face for anyone cruel enough to read it. The oversized hoodie that she used as armor suddenly felt inadequate, and she was acutely aware of how she must look to the other students who were beginning to gather around them like spectators at a gladiatorial match. The insults stung with the particular pain that came from being true enough to hurt, but false enough to feel unfair. Kira knew she wasn't conventionally beautiful like Madison, but she had never considered herself particularly unattractive either. She had her grandmother's eyes and her mother's delicate bone structure, and before the move to Roosevelt High, she had felt reasonably confident about her appearance. But months of subtle and not-so-subtle attacks on her self-image had eroded that confidence until she found herself questioning everything from her choice of clothing to the way she wore her hair. But Kira had learned through painful experience to keep her expression neutral when facing these attacks. She had dealt with bullies before, though never ones quite this persistent or sophisticated in their cruelty. At Millbrook Academy, the few instances of bullying she had encountered had been relatively straightforward affairs that could be resolved through direct confrontation or simply by ignoring the perpetrators until they grew bored and moved on to easier targets. But Blake and his companions seemed to view her silence and lack of retaliation as a challenge rather than a deterrent, interpreting her restraint as weakness rather than strength. "You know what your problem is?" Blake said, taking a deliberate step closer until Kira could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of the protein shake he'd probably consumed that morning as part of his rigorous athletic regimen. The proximity felt threatening and invasive, a violation of her personal space that made every instinct scream at her to either flee or fight. "You think you're too good for the rest of us, walking around here like you're better than everyone else just because you keep to yourself and act all mysterious." "I don't think that," Kira replied, her voice still quiet but gaining a slight edge that she hoped they wouldn't notice. The accusation was so far from the truth that it almost made her laugh. If anything, she felt completely out of place at Roosevelt High, like an alien trying to navigate an incomprehensible foreign culture where she didn't speak the language or understand the rules. "Oh, so she does have opinions after all," Tyler said with exaggerated surprise, beginning to circle around behind her like a predator positioning himself for an attack. His movement was calculated and deliberate, designed to make her feel trapped and surrounded. "Tell us, Hoodie girl, what exactly goes through that weird little head of yours? When you're sitting there all alone at lunch like some kind of social reject, what deep thoughts are occupying your magnificent brain?" The question hit closer to home than Tyler could have realized. During those solitary lunch periods in the library, Kira's mind was usually occupied with thoughts of her former life, memories of training sessions at her old dojo, and elaborate fantasies about what she would do to these tormentors if she were free to act on her impulses. She thought about the black belt hanging in her bedroom closet, hidden away like a shameful secret. She thought about the regional championship trophy gathering dust on her bookshelf, a reminder of skills she was forbidden to use. Most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to her parents and the incident that had necessitated it. Kira's hands clenched into fists inside the front pocket of her hoodie, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining self-control. If only they knew what she was really thinking about during those quiet moments. If only they knew about the hours she spent each evening in the converted garage that served as her private training space, working through forms and combinations with a precision and power that would have impressed her former sensei. If only they knew about the black belt in karate and brown belt in judo that she had earned through years of dedicated training, or the regional championship she had won just weeks before the move that had torn her away from everything familiar. But they couldn't know. Her parents, David and Sarah Westbrook, had made her promise to keep her martial arts background secret after the incident at Millbrook Academy that had changed everything. The memory of that day still haunted her dreams sometimes. The way Derek Hamilton had cornered her in the empty hallway after school, his hands grabbing at her in ways that made her skin crawl, his voice whispering threats about what would happen if she told anyone. The perfectly executed hip throw that had sent him crashing into the lockers with enough force to give him a severe concussion had been pure instinct, muscle memory taking over when her conscious mind had frozen in panic and fear. The school administration had covered up the incident, officially calling it an accident while privately making it clear that any repetition would result in serious consequences. Derek's parents had threatened legal action until they learned about their son's behavior leading up to the accident, at which point they had quietly withdrawn their threats and transferred him to a private school across town. But the damage had been done. Word of Kira's hidden abilities had spread through the small school community, and suddenly she had gone from being a quiet, unassuming student to being someone that others either feared or wanted to test their skills against. Her parents, terrified by the potential consequences of their daughter's abilities becoming public knowledge, had made her promise to never use her martial arts training except in the most extreme circumstances. They had visions of lawsuits, criminal charges, and their daughter being labeled as a dangerous individual. The irony was not lost on Kira that the skills her parents had encouraged her to develop as a means of building confidence and self-discipline were now seen as a liability to be hidden rather than an asset to be proud of. "Just leave me alone," Kira said, trying to step around Blake to reach her locker and escape this increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. Her voice carried a note of pleading that she hated hearing, but the situation was escalating beyond her comfort zone, and she could feel her carefully maintained self-control beginning to fray around the edges. Blake moved smoothly to block her path again, his athletic reflexes allowing him to anticipate and counter her movement with ease. His friends laughed at her failed attempt to escape, the sound drawing even more attention from passing students who were beginning to slow their pace to watch the unfolding drama. "Oh, come on now," Blake said with mock hurt in his voice. "We're just trying to be friendly and welcoming. You're still relatively new here, right? Consider us your personal welcoming committee, here to help you understand how things work at Roosevelt High." "Some welcome," Kira muttered under her breath, the words escaping before she could stop them. The comment was barely audible, but in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the hallway, it carried clearly enough for all three of her tormentors to hear. "What was that?" Madison demanded, her voice sharp with sudden anger. Her beautiful features twisted into something ugly and threatening as she stepped closer, her phone still recording every moment of Kira's humiliation. "Did you just give us attitude? Did the little mouse just show some teeth?" Before Kira could respond or even fully process what was happening, Blake's hand shot out and flicked her hood back with a casual, almost lazy gesture that somehow managed to convey both contempt and ownership. The sudden exposure felt like being stripped naked in front of a crowd, and Kira's dark chestnut hair tumbled down around her shoulders in waves that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. The reaction from the gathered students was immediate and electric. Several pulled out their phones to capture the moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become social media content within minutes. Others simply stared, some with sympathy, but most with the kind of morbid fascination that drew people to slow down and gawk at traffic accidents. "There she is," Blake announced to his growing audience, with the flourish of a ringmaster introducing the main attraction. The mysterious Hoodie girl, revealed at last. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, actually, what is your name anyway? I don't think I've ever heard anyone actually use it." The question caught Kira off guard. In all their previous encounters, her tormentors had never bothered to ask for her actual name, seeming to prefer the dehumanizing nickname they had assigned her. The casual cruelty of it, that she had been attending the same school for months and they had never even cared enough to learn what she was called, hit her like a physical blow. Kira quickly pulled her hood back up, her cheeks burning with a humiliation so intense it felt like physical heat radiating from her skin. Around them, students were whispering and pointing, and she could hear the distinctive electronic sounds of phones, recording videos that would probably be uploaded to various social media platforms before she even made it to first period. This was exactly the kind of attention she had been desperately trying to avoid, the nightmare scenario that had kept her awake at night since starting at Roosevelt High. "Oh, she's shy," Tyler said mockingly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Don't worry, Hoodie girl. We're going to help you come out of your shell whether you want to or not. Consider it a public service." "Yeah," Madison added, her voice taking on the tone of someone discussing a particularly interesting science experiment. "Consider us your personal development team. By the time we're done with you, you'll be a whole new person." The threat was barely disguised, and Kira felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. There was something in Madison's tone that suggested their campaign against her was far from over, that this public humiliation was just the opening act in a much longer and more elaborate performance. The sharp, electronic sound of the first bell cut through the tension like a knife, signaling that students had 5 minutes to get to their first period classes. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle began to disperse reluctantly, many of them still recording or whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. But Blake and his friends seemed in no hurry to leave. Savoring the moment of Kira's obvious distress, Blake leaned in close to Kira, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, but that somehow felt more threatening than if he had shouted. His breath was warm against her ear, and she had to resist the urge to physically recoil from the unwanted intimacy of the gesture. "This is just the beginning, Hoodie girl," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise rather than a threat. "We own this school and everyone in it, and you're going to learn your place in our little ecosystem. The sooner you accept that, the easier this is going to be for everyone involved." The words hit Kira like ice water, and she felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. This wasn't just typical teenage bullying that would blow over once they got bored. This was something more systematic, more planned, more cruel. Blake wasn't just trying to humiliate her for entertainment, he was trying to break her completely, to reduce her to nothing more than a plaything for his amusement. As the trio walked away, their laughter echoing off the hallway walls like the cries of predatory birds, Kira stood frozen by her locker. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had trouble working the combination lock, the numbers seeming to blur together through the tears that she refused to let fall. She could feel the eyes of other students on her, some sympathetic but most simply curious, like observers watching an interesting but ultimately unimportant laboratory experiment. The feeling of exposure was overwhelming. For months, she had carefully cultivated her invisibility, becoming a ghost that haunted the hallways of Roosevelt High without really being seen. But now that protective anonymity had been stripped away, as surely as if Blake had physically torn her clothes off. She was visible now, marked as a target, and there would be no going back to the relative safety of obscurity. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Kira could tell that word of the hallway encounter was spreading through the school's complex social network like wildfire through dry grass. Students would look at her and then quickly look away when she met their eyes, and she caught fragments of conversations about the new girl and Blake's latest victim that made her stomach churn with anxiety and dread. In her first period American history class, Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to sense that something was wrong, but didn't say anything directly. Instead, she offered Kira a gentle smile and asked if she was feeling all right, a kindness that almost brought tears to Kira's eyes. But when Kira assured her teacher that she was fine, Mrs. Rodriguez didn't push the issue, perhaps recognizing that sometimes teenagers needed space to work through their problems rather than adult intervention that might make things worse. The whispers followed her from class to class like persistent ghosts. In English literature, she heard two girls discussing the video that Madison had apparently already posted to her social media accounts. In Algebra 2, a group of boys near the back of the room kept glancing in her direction and snickering among themselves. Even in chemistry, where the teacher usually maintained strict order, she could sense the undercurrent of gossip and speculation that her morning encounter had generated. By the time lunch period arrived, Kira felt like she was walking through a minefield where any wrong step might trigger another explosion of unwanted attention. She had retreated to her usual sanctuary in the library, where she hoped to eat her peanut butter and jelly sandwich in relative peace and anonymity. The library was supposed to be a safe space, a neutral zone where the usual social hierarchies and conflicts were temporarily suspended in favor of academic pursuits. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian who had always been kind to Kira, nodded sympathetically as she passed the circulation desk. The older woman had clearly heard about the morning's events and seemed to understand without being told that Kira needed a quiet place to collect herself. The library was nearly empty, except for a few dedicated students catching up on homework or research projects, creating an atmosphere of calm that felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the hallways. Kira had claimed her usual spot at a small table tucked away in the back corner near the poetry section, where she could see anyone approaching but remained relatively hidden from casual observation. She had just unwrapped her sandwich and opened her bottle of water when a familiar voice spoke beside her. "Hey, you're the Hoodie girl, right?" The voice was male, warm and concerned, rather than mocking or threatening. Kira looked up to see Jamie Chen standing next to her table, his kind brown eyes filled with genuine concern rather than the morbid curiosity she had been encountering all morning. Jamie was tall and lean, with the kind of naturally graceful posture that came from years of musical training, and his black hair fell in soft waves that he was constantly pushing back from his forehead. He carried his guitar case slung over one shoulder, marking him as one of the music students who often ate lunch in the practice rooms rather than the cafeteria. "My name is Kira," she said softly, grateful to finally have someone use her actual name rather than the dehumanizing nickname that Blake and his followers had assigned her. "I know," Jamie said, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. His casual assumption of welcome might have seemed presumptuous from someone else, but there was something about Jamie's demeanor that made it feel natural and non-threatening. "I heard what happened this morning. Blake's such an ass." The direct condemnation surprised Kira. Most students at Roosevelt High were careful not to speak ill of Blake Morrison, even when he wasn't around to hear it. His family's influence and his own social power made him effectively untouchable, and challenging him, even indirectly, was seen as social suicide by most of their classmates. "It's fine," Kira said automatically, though they both knew it was anything but fine. The lie came easily after months of practice, a reflexive response designed to minimize conflict and avoid drawing more attention to herself. "No, it's not," Jamie insisted, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised her. "He had no right to do that to you. None of them did. What they're doing isn't just mean, it's harassment and it's wrong." For a moment, Kira felt something warm and unfamiliar spread through her chest. It had been so long since someone had shown her genuine kindness without expecting anything in return that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Jamie's concern seemed real and unforced. Not like the performative sympathy she sometimes got from teachers who saw the bullying but felt powerless or unwilling to do anything meaningful to stop it. "Thanks," she said, and for the first time in months, she meant it completely. "Look, I know we don't know each other very well," Jamie continued, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the table surface as he spoke. "But if you ever want to sit with me and my friends at lunch, you're absolutely welcome to join us. We usually eat in the music room or sometimes outside by the art building. We're not the cool kids or anything, but we're not jerks either." The offer hit Kira like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in an ocean of hostility and isolation. For months, she had eaten lunch alone, either in the library or in empty classrooms, avoiding the social minefield of the cafeteria where seating arrangements were as carefully regulated as international treaties. The idea of having somewhere to belong, even temporarily, was almost too wonderful to believe. Kira felt tears prick at her eyes, and she had to blink rapidly to keep them from falling. "That's really nice of you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion she was trying hard to suppress. "Think about it," Jamie said, standing up and shouldering his guitar case. "And hey, don't let Blake get to you. I know it's easier said than done, but he's all talk and bluster. He's a coward who only picks on people he thinks won't fight back." As Jamie walked away, his guitar case tapping gently against his leg with each step, Kira felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe Roosevelt High didn't have to be a prison sentence. Maybe she could find her place here after all, could build connections and friendships that would make the daily struggle worthwhile. For the first time since arriving at this school, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she might actually be happy. That fragile hope was shattered exactly 20 minutes later when Blake and his companions cornered her in the back stacks of the library, far from Mrs. Patterson's watchful eyes and protective presence. They had waited until the elderly librarian stepped out for her scheduled break, leaving the library effectively unmonitored except for a few scattered students who were too absorbed in their own work to pay attention to what was happening in the secluded poetry section. "Did you really think you could hide from us in here?" Blake asked, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable undertone of menace. His athletic frame seemed even more imposing in the confined space between the tall bookshelves, and Kira felt trapped like a rabbit cornered by wolves. "We saw you talking to Jamie Chen," Madison said, her voice dripping with false sweetness that was somehow more threatening than outright hostility. Her perfectly applied lip gloss caught the fluorescent lighting as she smiled, but there was nothing warm or friendly in the expression. "Making friends, are we? How sweet." "He's a nice person," Kira said, trying to keep her voice steady and project more confidence than she felt. The last thing she wanted was to show these predators any sign of weakness that they could exploit. "Nice?" Tyler laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the relative quiet of the library. "He's a loser, just like you. A perfect match made in social outcast heaven." Blake stepped closer, and Kira could feel her heart beginning to race as her body's fight-or-flight response kicked into high gear. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to fight back, to use the skills that had been drilled into her through years of dedicated training and practice. Her muscles tensed automatically, her weight shifting subtly to the balls of her feet, her hands beginning to form the defensive positions that had become second nature through countless hours of repetition. But she couldn't. She had made a promise to her parents, and despite everything that had happened, she couldn't bring herself to break that sacred trust. The memory of their frightened faces after the incident at Millbrook Academy, their desperate pleas for her to control herself and never let anything like that happen again, held her back more effectively than any physical restraint could have. "Here's the thing about friends," Blake said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge that made the hair on the back of Kira's neck stand up. "When you're at the bottom of the food chain like you are, making friends just gives us more ways to hurt you, more pressure points to exploit." "What do you mean?" Kira asked, though she was beginning to understand with growing horror exactly what he was implying. I mean that sweet little Jamie might find himself having some unexpected problems if you don't learn to stay in your designated lane, Blake replied, his ice blue eyes never leaving her face as he spoke. Maybe his precious guitar gets broken in some unfortunate accident. Maybe his grades start slipping mysteriously because his homework keeps disappearing or getting destroyed. Maybe he starts receiving the same kind of special attention you've been getting. The threat hit Kira like a physical blow to the stomach, driving the air from her lungs and making her feel sick with a combination of rage and helplessness. She had learned to endure the bullying directed at her personally, developing a kind of emotional armor that allowed her to survive their attacks on her dignity and self-worth. But the thought of Jamie suffering because of his association with her was unbearable, a violation of everything she believed about friendship and loyalty. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, but still lacking the commanding presence she wished she could project. "He hasn't done anything to you. That's entirely up to you," Blake said with a cruel smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Stay away from him. Keep your mouth shut about our little conversations, and maybe nothing unfortunate happens to your new friend." "But if you don't," Madison added, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made the threat even more chilling, "well, let's just say Jamie's going to have a very unpleasant rest of the school year, and it will be entirely your fault." Tyler nodded in agreement, his narrow face twisted into an expression of malicious anticipation. "We're very creative when it comes to making people's lives miserable. You've only seen a small sample of what we're capable of." As the trio left her alone in the stacks, their footsteps echoing off the library walls like the sound of retreating storm clouds, Kira sank into a nearby chair and buried her face in her hands. She felt more trapped than ever before, caught between her desire to protect Jamie and her own need for human connection. The bullying directed at her personally was something she could endure, but she couldn't bear the thought of someone else suffering because of her mere existence. The weight of isolation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She would have to distance herself from Jamie, which meant giving up the one ray of hope and human kindness she had found in this hostile environment. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only were they tormenting her directly, but they were also ensuring that she remained completely alone and friendless by threatening anyone who showed her compassion. The next few weeks fell into a depressing pattern that seemed designed to systematically break down her spirit and sense of self-worth. Every day brought new humiliations, new ways for Blake and his friends to remind her of her place in the school's carefully maintained social hierarchy. They would knock books from her hands in the hallways, sending her papers scattering across the floor, while other students stepped over them without offering to help. They would make loud, cutting comments about her appearance when she passed, their voices carrying just far enough to ensure that other students heard and understood the social dynamics at play. The psychological warfare was relentless and sophisticated. Madison had started a subtle campaign on social media, posting carefully crafted messages that never mentioned Kira by name but were clearly directed at her. Photos of designer clothes and expensive accessories were accompanied by captions about knowing your place and some people trying too hard to fit in where they don't belong. The comments sections filled with responses from other students who either didn't understand the targeting or chose to participate in the collective cruelty. Tyler had taken to accidentally bumping into her in crowded hallways, using his size and momentum to send her stumbling into walls or other students. Each collision was perfectly calculated to seem unintentional to any casual observer, but the frequency and timing made it clear that these were deliberate attacks designed to keep her off balance and anxious. Blake's approach was perhaps the most insidious because it often came disguised as concern or helpfulness. He would appear beside her locker with a false smile and ask how she was adjusting to Roosevelt High, his voice loud enough for other students to hear and interpret as friendly interest. But his words always carried double meanings and subtle threats that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. The worst part of the entire ordeal was watching Jamie's confused and hurt expression when she started avoiding him. He had tried to approach her several times in those first few days after Blake's threat, but she had made excuses and walked away, citing urgent homework or family obligations that they both knew were fabrications. She could see that he was wondering what he had done wrong, and it broke her heart to hurt someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. One afternoon in late October, as the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, Kira was walking through the school's small courtyard when she spotted Jamie sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench. His guitar lay across his lap, and his fingers moved slowly across the strings, picking out a melancholy melody that seemed to mirror her own emotional state. The music was beautiful and sad, speaking of loneliness and confusion in ways that words couldn't capture. He looked genuinely melancholy, and Kira realized with a pang of guilt that she might have been the cause of his sadness. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect him from Blake's cruelty, she had ended up hurting him herself through her deliberate rejection of his friendship. She wanted desperately to go to him, to explain why she had been avoiding him, and to apologize for the pain she had caused. But she knew she couldn't risk Blake's retaliation, couldn't bear the thought of Jamie becoming a target because of her selfish desire for human connection. "Touching scene," a familiar voice said behind her, dripping with mock sympathy. Kira turned to find Madison approaching, her usual smirk firmly in place, and her phone ready to capture whatever entertainment value she could extract from the situation. The other girl's presence felt like a contamination of the peaceful courtyard, introducing an element of malice into what had been a moment of quiet beauty. "You know, I almost feel sorry for him," Madison continued, gesturing toward Jamie with a perfectly manicured finger. "He really thought you were going to be friends. Poor thing has no idea that you're just using him as some kind of social experiment." "Just leave him alone," Kira said quietly, but her voice carried an undercurrent of desperation that Madison was quick to pick up on. "Oh, we are leaving him alone," Madison replied with false generosity, "as long as you keep being a good girl and staying away from him like you're supposed to. But you know what? I think he's starting to figure out that you're avoiding him on purpose. He's not stupid, despite what you might think." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. Kira had noticed that Jamie's attempts to approach her had become less frequent and more hesitant, suggesting that he was indeed beginning to understand that her avoidance was deliberate rather than coincidental. "What do you want from me?" Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a note of exhausted defeat that surprised even her. "I want you to understand your place in the natural order of things," Madison said, her voice taking on a harder edge that revealed the cruelty beneath her beautiful exterior. "You're nobody here. You're less than nobody. You're a ghost, a footnote, a piece of background scenery that exists solely for our entertainment, and the sooner you accept that reality, the easier your pathetic little life will be." "I'm not bothering anyone," Kira protested weakly, but even as she said the words, she knew they wouldn't matter to someone like Madison. "Your existence bothers us," Madison replied with icy finality. "The way you walk around here, like you have some big secret, like you're better than everyone else despite being obviously inferior in every measurable way. It's pathetic and annoying, and we're going to keep reminding you of your place until you learn to accept it." "If only you knew what my secret really is," Kira thought, her hands clenching into fists inside her hoodie pockets. "If only you knew what I was really capable of, you might not be so eager to push me to my breaking point." But she said nothing, just stood there and absorbed the verbal assault like she always did. Madison eventually grew bored with the one-sided conversation and walked away, leaving Kira alone with her thoughts and her growing sense of trapped rage. That evening, Kira spent nearly 3 hours in the converted garage that served as her private training space, working through forms and combinations with an intensity that worried her mother. The garage had been transformed into a makeshift dojo, with heavy mats covering the concrete floor and a variety of training equipment arranged around the perimeter. Her father had hung her tournament trophies and belt certificates on one wall, creating a shrine to the accomplishments she was no longer allowed to acknowledge publicly. She attacked the heavy bag with kicks and punches that would have impressed her former sensei, Master Tanaka, channeling all her frustration and rage into the familiar rhythm of combat training. Each strike was perfectly executed, her form flawless despite the emotional turmoil that drove her movements. The bag swayed and shuddered under the assault, absorbing the force of blows that could have seriously injured a human opponent. "You're going to hurt yourself if you keep this up," her mother said from the doorway, her voice filled with concern as she watched her daughter's increasingly violent assault on the training equipment. Sarah Westbrook was a petite woman with the same dark hair and green eyes as her daughter, but where Kira's features held an intensity that suggested hidden depths, Sarah's face showed the worry lines of a mother watching her child struggle with forces beyond her control. She had been the one to initially encourage Kira's martial arts training, seeing it as a way to build confidence and self-discipline in a naturally shy child. Now, she sometimes wondered if they had created a monster they couldn't control. "I'm fine," Kira replied without stopping her relentless attack on the heavy bag, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the cool autumn air, and her breathing came in sharp, controlled bursts that spoke of both physical exertion and emotional distress. "No, you're not," her mother said firmly, stepping into the garage and positioning herself where Kira would have to acknowledge her presence. "You're angry, and you're letting that anger consume you. That's not what martial arts is supposed to teach you, and you know it." The words hit home because they were true. Master Tanaka had always emphasized that martial arts were about more than physical technique. They were about mental discipline, emotional control, and the wisdom to know when violence was appropriate and when it was not. The anger that currently drove Kira's training would have disappointed her old teacher, who had always preached that true strength came from restraint rather than aggression. Kira finally stopped her assault on the bag, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "What's the point of all this training if I can't use it when I need it?" she asked, her voice breaking with the accumulated frustration of months of helpless endurance. "The point is self-control," her mother replied, her voice gentle but firm. "The point is knowing that you have the power to defend yourself and others without needing to prove it to everyone around you. The point is being strong enough to choose restraint when others would choose violence. But they're making my life hell," Kira said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Every single day, they find new ways to humiliate me and tear down what little self-respect I have left. And now they're threatening Jamie just because he tried to be nice to me. How is that fair? How is any of this fair?" Her mother's expression softened with sympathy and understanding. Sarah had been bullied herself as a teenager, though never to the extent that her daughter was experiencing. She understood the feeling of helplessness, the way that constant harassment could erode someone's sense of self-worth, until they began to believe that they deserved the treatment they were receiving. "I know it's hard, sweetheart," she said, moving closer and placing a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But you made a promise to us and to yourself. And promises matter. There has to be another way to deal with this situation." "Like what?" Kira asked bitterly, her voice filled with the desperation of someone who had exhausted all reasonable options. "Tell the teachers? They don't care, or they're too afraid of Blake's family influence to do anything meaningful. Tell the principal? He's more concerned about the school's reputation than student welfare. Call the police? They'll just say it's a school matter and refer us back to the administration. Then you find another way, her mother said, though her voice lacked conviction. But you don't break your promise unless you absolutely have to. When would that be? Kira asked, looking directly into her mother's eyes with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When is it okay to fight back? What would have to happen for you to release me from this promise? Her mother was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. When she finally spoke, her words would prove to be prophetic in ways that neither of them could have imagined. When someone you care about is in immediate physical danger, she said slowly, when walking away is no longer an option because doing so would result in serious harm to yourself or others. When doing nothing would cause more damage than fighting back. Those words would echo in Kira's mind over the coming days, becoming a kind of litmus test for when her promise might be set aside in favor of more direct action. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when the first frost of the season had painted the world in silver and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Kira had taken a different route to school, hoping to avoid Blake and his friends by varying her routine and timing. The strategy had worked for several days, allowing her to reach her locker without incident and begin each day without the immediate stress of confrontation. But apparently, they had been watching and learning from her evasive maneuvers. They were waiting for her in the small park that sat between her apartment complex and the school grounds, a patch of green space with scattered trees and benches that was usually empty at this early hour. The park was technically public property, which meant that school rules about harassment and bullying didn't officially apply, giving Blake and his friends more freedom to escalate their tactics. "Going somewhere special this morning?" Blake asked, stepping out from behind a large oak tree like a predator emerging from its lair. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and his usual confident smile was replaced by something hungrier and more dangerous. Tyler and Madison emerged from other hiding spots around the park, effectively surrounding Kira in a triangle formation that cut off her most obvious escape routes. The choreography was deliberate and practiced, suggesting that they had planned this encounter carefully and considered multiple scenarios for how it might unfold. Kira's training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that Master Tanaka had drilled into her through countless sparring sessions. 3 opponents, open terrain with scattered obstacles, multiple potential escape routes if she could break through their formation. The tactical assessment was almost comforting in its familiarity, providing a framework for thinking about the situation in concrete rather than emotional terms. She could handle this if she had to. The realization was both liberating and terrifying, carrying with it the weight of consequences that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "I'm going to school," she said calmly, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her system. "See, that's your problem right there," Blake said, beginning to circle her slowly like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think you get to just go about your business like nothing's happening, like you haven't been disrespecting us for months with your stubborn refusal to acknowledge your place in the social order." "I haven't done anything to you," Kira replied, turning slowly to keep Blake in her field of vision while remaining aware of Tyler and Madison's positions through her peripheral vision. "You exist," Madison said viciously, her beautiful features twisted into an expression of pure malice. "That's more than enough. Your presence here is an insult to everyone who actually belongs." "You know what I think?" Tyler added, his voice carrying the excitement of someone anticipating violence. "I think you need to learn a lesson, a real lesson that you'll never forget." Blake pulled out his latest model smartphone and activated the camera function, holding it up to capture whatever was about to unfold. The red recording light blinked steadily, documenting what would either be Kira's complete humiliation or her moment of liberation. "This is going to be so good," he said with genuine anticipation. "The whole school's going to see what happens when someone thinks they can ignore the natural order of things. This is going viral for sure." "What are you doing?" Kira asked, though she was beginning to understand with growing alarm exactly what they had planned. "We're going to give you a complete makeover," Madison said, with a cruel smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Starting with that stupid hoodie you're always hiding behind like some kind of security blanket." Before Kira could react or even fully process the threat, Tyler moved in from behind and grabbed her backpack, yanking it off her shoulders with enough force to nearly knock her off balance. The sudden assault on her personal property triggered something primitive in her brain, an instinctive response to being attacked that her months of restraint had barely managed to suppress. Blake moved in from the front, his hands reaching for the zipper of her hoodie with clear intent to strip it away from her. Madison positioned herself to get the best camera angle, her phone ready to capture every moment of what they clearly intended to be a complete humiliation. "Stop," Kira said, but her voice was lost in their excited laughter and crude commentary about what they were going to do to her. Blake's hands gripped the sides of her hoodie and pulled hard, trying to yank it over her head while she was still wearing it. The fabric stretched and strained under the assault, and Kira felt a surge of panic that went beyond mere embarrassment. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was about violation, about stripping away the last barrier she had between herself and a world that seemed determined to destroy her. The hoodie was more than just clothing to her. It was armor, protection, a cocoon that allowed her to move through the hostile environment of Roosevelt High without feeling completely exposed and vulnerable. The thought of losing it, of being left defenseless before their cameras and their cruelty, triggered something primal and desperate in her psyche. "Please stop," she said, louder this time. But her plea was met with more laughter and increasingly aggressive attempts to remove her clothing. "Oh, now she's begging," Tyler laughed, his voice filled with sadistic glee. "This is absolutely perfect. Make sure you're getting all of this, Madison." Blake pulled harder, and Kira felt the seams of her beloved hoodie beginning to give way under the strain. The sound of tearing fabric was like a gunshot in the cold morning air, representing the destruction of something that had become integral to her sense of identity and safety. In that moment, faced with the imminent violation of her person and the complete destruction of her dignity, Kira made a decision that would change everything. She thought about Jamie, sitting alone on that bench looking sad and confused. She thought about her mother's words about immediate danger and the need to protect those she cared about. She thought about the promise she had made and the reasons behind it, weighing them against the reality of what was happening to her right now. And then she stopped thinking altogether and started acting on pure instinct and years of muscle memory. Blake never saw the move coming, focused as he was on his assault on her clothing and confident in his physical superiority. One moment he was pulling at her hoodie, laughing at her distress and enjoying his power over her, and the next moment he was flying through the air like he had been launched from a catapult. Kira had grabbed his wrists as he pulled, stepped back to create leverage, and executed a perfect hip throw that her old sensei would have been proud of. Blake's feet left the ground completely, his body describing a perfect arc through the morning air before crashing to the frost-covered grass 6 feet away. The impact drove the air from his lungs with an audible whoosh, and he lay there gasping like a fish out of water, his face red with shock and the struggle to breathe. Tyler stared in shock for exactly 1 second before his brain processed what had happened and triggered his own aggressive response. He charged at Kira with his fists raised, clearly intending to overwhelm her with brute force and superior size. But Kira was no longer the helpless victim he thought he was attacking. She pivoted smoothly on the balls of her feet, her body moving with the fluid grace that came from years of dedicated training. As Tyler's momentum carried him forward, she caught his leading arm and used his own force against him, redirecting his energy and sending him tumbling past her in a move that looked almost effortless. He hit the ground hard and rolled several times before coming to a stop against the base of a tree. His shoulder twisted at an angle that suggested significant pain, if not actual injury. Madison was screaming now, her carefully maintained composure shattered by the sudden reversal of what was supposed to have been their moment of triumph. Her phone lay forgotten in the grass where she had dropped it, the screen cracked from the impact, but still recording the aftermath of what had just occurred. "What did you do to them?" she demanded, her voice shrill with panic and disbelief. "What the hell did you just do?" "I defended myself," Kira replied, her voice steady and calm in a way that it hadn't been for months. She felt different, like she had finally stepped into her own skin after spending forever hiding inside someone else's life. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. Blake was trying to get to his feet, his face a study in rage and humiliation. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled and full of grass and dirt, and his expensive clothes bore the stains of his impact with the ground. More than that, his entire sense of identity had been shattered by the realization that his victim was not as helpless as he had believed. "You little freak!" he snarled, his voice rough from the wind being knocked out of him. "What the hell was that? Where did you learn to do that?" "That was judo," Kira replied calmly, feeling a sense of liberation in finally being able to acknowledge her abilities openly. "And if you come at me again, I'll be happy to demonstrate some karate techniques as well." Tyler was holding his shoulder and grimacing with pain, but his eyes burned with a hatred that was almost palpable. "You're completely insane. You can't just attack people like that." "I didn't attack anyone," Kira said, her green eyes flashing with a righteous anger that had been building for months. "You attacked me. You've been attacking me for months, systematically trying to destroy my self-worth and isolate me from any possibility of friendship or happiness. I just finally decided that I wasn't going to be your victim anymore." The truth of her words hung in the cold morning air like a challenge. For months, she had endured their campaign of psychological terrorism, accepting their abuse and trying to minimize the damage through avoidance and submission. But something fundamental had shifted in those few seconds of physical confrontation, and she knew that there would be no going back to the way things had been. Blake was on his feet now, but he kept his distance, no longer confident in his ability to dominate her through physical intimidation. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, like a predator that had suddenly discovered its prey, had claws and knew how to use them. "You're going to pay for this," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence and authority. "When we get to school, everyone's going to know what you did. You're going to be expelled, arrested, probably sent to juvenile detention." "Good," Kira said with a confidence that surprised even her. "Maybe they should know what really happened here. Maybe everyone should know what you three have been doing to me for months." She looked directly at Madison, who was still staring at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Did you get all that on your phone? Make sure you post the whole video, not just the part where I defended myself. Show them what you were trying to do to me first. Show them the context." Madison's face went pale as she realized the implications of what Kira was suggesting. The video she had captured would indeed show the attempted assault, the 3-on-1 attack, and the clear self-defense nature of Kira's response. Rather than being evidence of Kira's guilt, it would be proof of their own criminal behavior. "This isn't over," Blake snarled. But the threat carried little weight now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. "Yes, it is," Kira said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that she had never possessed before. "It's over because I'm not going to let you hurt me anymore. And if you even think about going after Jamie or anyone else who tries to be kind to me, I'll make sure the whole school knows exactly what kind of people you really are." As the three former bullies limped away from the park, their perfect morning of planned humiliation having turned into their own public defeat, Kira stood among the frost-covered grass, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: complete and total freedom. The weight of secrecy and fear that had been crushing her spirit was gone, replaced by a sense of empowerment that was almost intoxicating in its intensity. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, she felt like herself again. She arrived at school that morning to find that word of the park incident had already spread through the student body with the speed and efficiency that only teenage gossip networks could achieve. The modern miracle of social media meant that news of dramatic events could circle the entire school before the first bell even rang, and Kira's confrontation with Blake and his friends had apparently been too juicy a story to keep secret. Students were clustering in small groups throughout the hallways, their voices dropping to urgent whispers whenever she passed. Some looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, as if she had suddenly transformed from a harmless background figure into something dangerous and unpredictable. Others stared with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents or natural disasters, clearly hoping to witness whatever drama might unfold next. The whispered conversations that reached her ears were a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and nervous excitement. "Did you see the video?" she heard one girl ask her friend. "Blake Morrison got absolutely destroyed." Another student was describing the fight to someone who had missed it. "She threw him like he weighed nothing. It was insane." Some had clearly seen Madison's video, which had indeed captured the entire encounter, including Blake's assault on her hoodie and her subsequent self-defense. The footage provided irrefutable evidence that she had been the victim rather than the aggressor, a fact that seemed to be shifting public opinion in her favor for the first time since she had arrived at Roosevelt High. "Kira!" a familiar voice called out, cutting through the ambient noise of hallway chatter. She turned to see Jamie Chen approaching, his face filled with a mixture of concern and amazement that was almost comical in its intensity. His guitar case bounced against his back as he half-jogged to catch up with her, and his usually perfectly organized hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it in agitation. "Are you okay?" he asked breathlessly as he reached her side. "I heard what happened in the park this morning. Actually, I saw the video. Everyone's seen the video by now." "I'm fine," she said, and for the first time in months, the words were completely true rather than a defensive lie designed to deflect further inquiry. "I can't believe you threw Blake Morrison," Jamie said, shaking his head in amazement. His brown eyes were wide, with a combination of admiration and disbelief that made Kira feel oddly proud of her actions, despite the potential consequences. "I mean, I've always thought he was an asshole who deserved to be taken down a peg, but I never imagined anyone would actually do it. Where did you learn to fight like that?" The question opened a door that Kira had been keeping locked for months, and she found herself surprisingly eager to walk through it. The secrecy that had felt so necessary and protective now seemed like just another prison that she was ready to escape. "I've been training in martial arts since I was 7 years old," she admitted, feeling a sense of relief at finally being able to acknowledge this fundamental part of her identity. "Karate, judo, some aikido. I have a black belt in karate and a brown belt in judo. I just never told anyone because—" She paused, unsure how to explain the complicated circumstances that had led to her enforced silence about her abilities. The story of Derek Hamilton and the incident at Millbrook Academy felt too personal and complicated to share in a crowded hallway, but Jamie seemed to understand that there was more to the story than she was ready to reveal. "Because you were afraid of what would happen if people knew," he finished for her, his voice carrying an understanding that surprised her with its depth. "Exactly," she said gratefully. "I was afraid I'd hurt someone, or that people would expect me to use my training to solve problems that should be handled other ways." But you didn't hurt them, Jamie pointed out with the logical precision that made him such a good student. I mean, not really. You just stopped them from hurting you. There's a big difference between self-defense and aggression. His words echoed something that Master Tanaka had taught her years ago about the difference between martial arts as a tool for protection versus martial arts as a weapon for domination. The distinction had always been important to her sensei, who had emphasized that true martial artists use their skills to protect the innocent rather than to intimidate or harm others. Throughout the morning, Kira noticed a dramatic change in how people treated her as she moved through her classes. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now nodded respectfully when she passed in the hallways. Others approached her directly to offer their support, sharing their own stories of being bullied by Blake and his friends and expressing gratitude that someone had finally stood up to them. "Thank you," said a small freshman girl who caught up with Kira between classes. "Blake and his friends have been making my life hell since school started. No one ever stands up to them because everyone's too scared. What you did this morning, it gives the rest of us hope." The conversation was brief, but it highlighted something that Kira hadn't fully considered in her focus on her own survival. Blake and his friends had been terrorizing other students as well, and her act of defiance had resonated far beyond her personal situation. She was beginning to understand that her choice to fight back had implications that extended well beyond her own immediate circumstances. Blake himself was notably absent from his usual haunts throughout the morning. Word spread quickly that he had gone home early, claiming to be sick, though everyone understood that his absence was more about wounded pride than physical injury. His sudden retreat from the social battlefield he had dominated for so long sent a clear message about the shift in power dynamics that had occurred. Tyler was seen in the nurse's office during second period, still favoring his shoulder and wearing an expression that mixed pain with barely controlled rage. Several students reported overhearing him on his phone with his father, apparently trying to convince the prominent lawyer to take legal action against Kira for assault. But the existence of Madison's video, which clearly showed the three of them attacking Kira first, made any legal response problematic at best. Madison sat alone at lunch for the first time in recent memory, her usual circle of followers having mysteriously dispersed like fair-weather friends, abandoning a sinking ship. The girl who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just hours earlier now looked isolated and vulnerable, experiencing perhaps for the first time what it felt like to be on the receiving end of social rejection. The real test of how much things had changed came the next day when Kira was walking to her locker and saw Blake approaching from the opposite direction. The hallway fell silent as other students sensed the potential for another confrontation, their conversations stopping mid-sentence as they turned to watch the drama unfold. Blake's face still bore the faint bruises from his impact with the ground, and his usual swagger was notably absent. His expensive clothes looked somehow less impressive, and his carefully styled hair seemed to have lost its ability to catch the light in quite the same way. More importantly, his aura of untouchable confidence had been shattered, replaced by something more uncertain and human. As they drew closer, Kira prepared herself mentally for another fight, her body automatically shifting into a more centered stance that would allow her to respond quickly if he chose to escalate the situation. But as Blake reached the point where their paths would intersect, something unexpected happened. He stepped aside. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a deliberate acknowledgement of her right to pass unimpeded. His eyes never met hers, and his jaw was tight with the effort of swallowing his pride, but the message was clear to everyone watching. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "Did Blake Morrison just back down?" a student whispered behind her, his voice filled with amazement. "Holy shit," another replied with barely contained excitement. "The world has officially ended. Blake Morrison backed down from someone." The incident became part of Roosevelt High folklore almost immediately, spreading through the social networks of the school like wildfire. Students who had never paid attention to either Blake or Kira suddenly found themselves fascinated by the dramatic reversal of fortune that had occurred. Blake Morrison, who had seemed untouchable and all-powerful just days earlier, had been brought low by a quiet girl that most of them had never even noticed before. At lunch, Kira finally accepted Jamie's long-standing invitation to sit with his friends in the music room. The space was cluttered with instruments, music stands, and the accumulated debris of countless practice sessions, but it felt warm and welcoming in a way that the sterile cafeteria never had. Jamie's friends were a diverse group of artists, musicians, and academic overachievers who had formed their own tight-knit community outside the school's traditional social hierarchy. They welcomed her warmly, treating her like she had always been part of their group, rather than making a big production of her inclusion. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, Kira felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had found her tribe among the other students who valued creativity and intelligence over social status and physical attractiveness. "So you're like a secret ninja?" asked Rebecca Martinez, a girl with purple-streaked hair who edited the school newspaper and had a reputation for asking direct questions that others were too polite to voice. "Not exactly," Kira laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "More like a very well-trained person who finally got tired of being pushed around by people who mistake cruelty for strength." "Well, you've certainly made an impression," said Marcus Washington, a quiet boy who was apparently some kind of mathematical genius and was already taking college-level calculus as a junior. "Blake's been hiding in the library all day, and I've never seen him voluntarily read a book in his entire life." The image of Blake Morrison, former king of Roosevelt High, reduced to hiding among the dusty stacks of the school library, was both satisfying and slightly sad. Kira found that she didn't take as much pleasure in his downfall as she had expected, perhaps because she understood better than most what it felt like to be isolated and afraid. "I don't want to be a bully," she said seriously, wanting to make sure her new friends understood her motivations. "I just want to be left alone, to live my life, and maybe make some real friendships along the way." "That's all any of us want," Jamie said, his hand briefly touching hers in a gesture of support that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "And now, maybe we can actually have that without worrying about being targeted for harassment." The conversation turned to other topics: upcoming school events, college applications, and the various creative projects that occupied their free time. Kira found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced since leaving Millbrook Academy, allowing her personality to emerge from behind the defensive walls she had built to protect herself from Blake's campaign of psychological warfare. 2 weeks later, Kira was surprised to find Blake waiting by her locker after school. He was alone, which was unusual since he rarely appeared in public without his usual entourage, and his typical arrogance was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked nervous and uncertain, like someone preparing to do something difficult and unpleasant. "Can I talk to you?" he asked quietly, his voice lacking the commanding presence that had once made other students automatically defer to his wishes. Kira tensed automatically, her body preparing for potential conflict, even though Blake's posture suggested that he wasn't looking for a fight. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral but wary. "I want to apologize," he said, the words seeming to cause him physical pain as they emerged from his mouth. "What we did to you was wrong. What I did was wrong. I know that now." The admission caught Kira completely off guard. This was literally the last thing she had expected from someone who had seemed incapable of acknowledging fault or showing genuine remorse. Blake Morrison apologizing was like witnessing a fundamental law of physics being violated. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked suspiciously, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate trap or manipulation designed to catch her off guard. Blake was quiet for a long moment, his ice blue eyes focused on the scuffed linoleum tiles rather than meeting her gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because my little sister saw the video," he said, his words carrying a weight of shame that transformed his entire demeanor. "Emma's only 10, and she asked me why I was being so mean to you. She wanted to know what you had done to deserve being treated like that." He paused, struggling with emotions that were clearly unfamiliar and uncomfortable for someone who had spent years cultivating an image of invulnerability. "I couldn't give her an answer that didn't make me sound like a monster," he continued. "Every explanation I tried just made me realize how cruel and pointless the whole thing was. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me, like I had become someone she was afraid of." The revelation that Blake had a younger sister who looked up to him added a human dimension to someone Kira had come to think of as purely predatory. The idea that a 10-year-old girl's disappointed opinion could accomplish what months of resistance and eventual retaliation had not was both touching and slightly surreal. "You were being a monster," Kira said bluntly, unwilling to let him off the hook even in the face of what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I know," Blake replied, his voice barely audible. "I know, and I'm sorry. I can't take back what I did, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix the damage I caused. But I can promise it won't happen again." Kira studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But Blake's regret seemed genuine, and she found herself remembering her mother's words about self-control and the importance of knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. "Apology accepted," she said finally, the words feeling strange but right as they left her mouth. "But if you ever come after me or my friends again, if you ever try to hurt someone just because you can, I won't be so restrained next time." Blake nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being offered something precious and fragile that could be withdrawn if he proved unworthy of it. "I understand, and for what it's worth, I'm glad you finally stood up for yourself. Someone needed to put me in my place, and I'm grateful it was someone who knew when to stop." As he walked away, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there during his months of unchallenged dominance, Kira reflected on how much had changed. She was no longer the quiet, scared girl who had transferred to Roosevelt High 6 months ago, hoping only to survive until graduation. She had found her voice, her strength, and most importantly, her place in a world that had seemed determined to reject her. The transformation wasn't just about her ability to defend herself physically, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the confidence that came from knowing she didn't have to accept mistreatment from anyone, that she had the power to stand up for herself and others when circumstances demanded it. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them that you weren't going to be their victim anymore, that their power over you was an illusion that could be shattered with the right combination of courage and skill. Jamie appeared beside her as she watched Blake disappear around the corner, his guitar case slung over his shoulder and a gentle smile playing across his features. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Where are we going?" Kira asked, though she was pretty sure she already knew the answer. "Jazz band practice," he said with enthusiasm. "I talked to Mr. Peterson about your martial arts background, and he said they could use someone to help with choreography for their performances. Apparently, martial arts and music have more in common than most people realize. They're both about rhythm, timing, and the disciplined pursuit of excellence." Kira laughed, feeling lighter and more optimistic than she had in years. The idea of combining her martial arts training with music was intriguing, offering a way to acknowledge her abilities openly while using them for creative rather than defensive purposes. "I'd like that," she said, meaning it completely. As they walked down the hallway together, Kira reached up and pulled back her hood, letting her dark chestnut hair fall freely around her shoulders for everyone to see. She no longer needed to hide behind fabric and shadows, no longer needed the protective anonymity that had been her shield for so many months. She had found something better than a disguise. She had found herself. The quiet, underestimated girl who had once been such an easy target was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and had friends who valued her for who she really was. Someone who would never again allow herself to be diminished by the cruelty of others, and who had the strength and skills to protect not just herself, but anyone else who might need defending. Roosevelt High had taught her many harsh lessons about human nature, social dynamics, and the sometimes brutal realities of adolescent life. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: sometimes the only way to find peace is to stop running from the fight and start standing up for what's right. Sometimes the person you save by taking a stand is not just yourself, but everyone who comes after you, who might have become victims if you had chosen to remain silent and passive. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in helping them find a better version of themselves, one that doesn't require the destruction of others to feel whole and powerful. As Kira walked toward the music room with Jamie at her side, she carried with her the knowledge that she had not just survived Roosevelt High, she had transformed it, and herself, in ways that would ripple outward far beyond her remaining time as a student there. She had learned to be both strong and compassionate, both fierce and forgiving, both a warrior and a peacemaker. And that, she realized, was exactly who she was meant to be.